The champagne glass didn't just slip from Julian's hand. It shattered his entire reality. For 3 years, Julian Vance, the ruthless CEO of Vance Global, thought he had won. He had the billions, the power, and the 23-year-old supermodel Mistress on his arm. He thought he had left his boring past behind when he served his wife divorce papers on their anniversary. But tonight, in the city's most exclusive restaurant, the air left his lungs. There she was, not crying, not broken, but glowing heavily pregnant and holding the hand of the one man Julian was terrified to cross. Karma didn't just knock, it kicked the door down. The chandeliers at l'Orangerie were made of authentic Venetian crystal, casting a fractured golden light over the heavy velvet drapes and the clientele that comprised New York's top 1%. It was the kind of establishment where the menu had no prices and the waiters moved with the silent, terrifying efficiency of assassins. Julian Vance adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke Brioni suit. He was 42, handsome, in a sharp, predatory way, with graying temples that the magazines called distinguished, and his competitors called stress fractures. He sat at the best table in the house, a secluded booth near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park. Across from him sat Tiffany, a vision in red silk scrolling incessantly through her phone. "Babe, look," Tiffany said, snapping her gum, a habit Julian loathed but tolerated because of her legs. She shoved her phone screen toward him. "The Daily Mail just posted about us. They called me the mystery brunette again. We really need to do a red carpet soon, so they learn my name." Julian took a sip of his scotch, aged 30 years. It tasted metallic tonight. "Not yet, Tiff. The board is still twitchy about the divorce settlement. If I flaunt you too publicly before the quarterly earnings call the stock dips," Tiffany pouted, dropping the phone onto the white tablecloth with a thud. "You've been divorced for 2 years, Julian. Sarah is gone. She's probably living in some sad apartment in Queens with her cats. Why does she still control our lives?" The mention of Sarah made Julian flinch, though he hid it behind a swirl of his glass. Sarah, his wife of 15 years. She had been the one who built Vance Global with him managing the books when they operated out of a garage in New Jersey. She was practical, soft-spoken, and in Julian's eyes towards the end, utterly uninspiring. When the money came, Julian wanted the lifestyle to match. He wanted Gala's yachts and a partner who looked good on a magazine cover. Sarah preferred quiet nights reading books and talking about starting a family, something they had tried to do for years without success. "She doesn't control us." Julian snapped his voice, sharper than intended. "It's about optics. Just eat your lobster." "It's cold," Tiffany complained, pushing the plate away. "And this place is boring. I wanted to go to Catch. This place smells like old money and dust." Julian sighed, rubbing his temples. This was his life now. Constant complaints, vacuous conversations, and a lingering sense of exhaustion that no amount of money could cure. He looked around the room, desperate for a distraction. He scanned the other tables. Senator Higgins was dining with a lobbyist in the corner. The owner of the Knicks was arguing with his wife near the kitchen. Then his gaze drifted to the private alcove near the piano, usually reserved for royalty or visiting heads of state. The hostess was leading a couple there. The man was tall, with broad shoulders that strained against a charcoal suit that Julian recognized immediately as a Savile Row masterpiece. He had a presence that sucked the oxygen out of the room, a dark, commanding aura that made the nearby diners lower their voices instinctively. "Who is that?" Tiffany whispered, actually looking up from her phone. "He looks important." Julian squinted. The lighting was dim. I think that's Alexander Sterling." Tiffany gasped. Even she knew the name. Alexander Sterling wasn't just a billionaire. He was an institution. He owned Sterling Maritime, the largest shipping conglomerate in the Atlantic, and had recently acquired half the tech sector in Silicon Valley. He was known as the Iron Duke on Wall Street, a man who never smiled and never lost. "He's handsome," Tiffany cooed. "Who is he with?" Julian watched as Alexander pulled out a chair. He moved with a surprising gentleness, a stark contrast to his brutal business reputation. He offered his hand to the woman beside him, helping her sit with a reverence that bordered on worship. The woman was turned away from Julian, her back visible. She wore a midnight blue gown that shimmered like liquid starlight. Her hair was pinned up in an elegant chignon, revealing a long, graceful neck adorned with a diamond necklace that Julian estimated was worth more than his penthouse. But it wasn't the diamonds that caught his eye. It was the silhouette. As she turned to the side to thank Alexander, the light caught her profile. Julian's Scotch glass slipped. It hit the table, not shattering, but spilling amber liquid all over the pristine tablecloth. "Julian! What the hell?" Tiffany shrieked as the liquid dripped onto her dress. Julian didn't hear her. He couldn't breathe. The room spun. The noise of the restaurant faded into a dull roar. That profile, the curve of that nose, the way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. It was Srao. But it wasn't the Sarah he had thrown away. That Sarah wore oversized sweaters to hide her figure and worried about the price of organic eggs. This Sarah looked like a queen. She was radiant, her skin luminous, her laughter audible even from across the room, a sound he hadn't heard in 5 years. And then the second hammer blow fell. As Alexander sat down, he reached across the table and placed his large hand gently over Sarah's stomach. Sarah smiled, covering his hand with hers, and looked down. There was a distinct, undeniable bump. Sarah was pregnant. "No," Julian whispered the word, strangling in his throat. "That's impossible." "What is impossible?" Tiffany was dabbing frantically at her dress with a napkin, her face twisted in annoyance. "That you just ruined my vintage Versace. Julian, look at me." Julian ignored her. He stood up, his legs feeling like lead. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice hollow. "Where are you going, Julian?" He navigated through the tables like a man in a trance. His mind was racing, replaying the final days of their marriage. The memory hit him 3 years ago, the living room of their suburban home. "I want a divorce, Sarah," Julian had said, checking his watch because he had a flight to catch with Tiffany. "I need more. I need someone who fits my future, not my past." Sarah hadn't screamed. She had just sat there looking small. "Is it because we can't have children?" she had asked quietly. "The doctor said it's stress, Julian. If we just slowed down." "It's not just that," Julian had yelled, guilty and defensive. "It's everything. You're stagnant. You're happy being a nobody. I'm a shark, Sarah. Sharks die if they stop moving. You're an anchor." He remembered the way she looked at him then, not with anger, but with pity. "You're making a mistake, Julian. One day, you'll realize that money is cold comfort at night." He had laughed at her. "I'll take my chances." He snapped back to the present. He was 10 feet away from their table now. Up close, the transformation was even more terrifying. Sarah wasn't just wearing expensive clothes. She wore confidence. The way she held her wine glass filled with sparkling water. He noted the way she tilted her head as Alexander spoke to her. It was graceful, aristocratic. Alexander Sterling was leaning in, murmuring something that made Sarah blush. The feared Iron Duke looked completely smitten. Julian stopped at the edge of their table. His shadow fell over them. Alexander stopped speaking mid-sentence. He slowly turned his head, his eyes cold, steel grey, locking onto Julian. The temperature at the table seemed to drop 10 degrees. Sarah looked up. For a second, there was no recognition in her eyes. Then it clicked, but there was no fear, no sadness, no longing. There was only a polite, distant curiosity, as if she were looking at a stranger who had accidentally walked into her home. "Julian," Sarah said. Her voice was smoother, lower than he remembered. "I didn't know you frequented l'orangerie." "Sarah," Julian croaked. He looked from her face to her stomach, then to Alexander, and back to her. You're dining," Alexander finished for her. His voice was a deep baritone that vibrated in Julian's chest. He didn't stand up. He didn't need to stand to assert dominance. "Can we help you, Mr. Vance? Or are you simply hovering?" Julian felt a flush of humiliation creeping up his neck. He was a billionaire. He was a CEO. But standing before Alexander Sterling, he felt like a junior intern. Julian stammered, trying to regain his composure. He straightened his back. "I saw Sarah, and I was surprised. It's been a long time." 3 years, 2 months, and 4 days, Sarah said calmly. She took a sip of her water. "But who's counting?" "You look different," Julian managed to say. "I am different," Sarah replied. She rested a hand protectively over her baby bump. The diamond on her ring finger caught the light. It was an emerald-cut diamond, easily 15 carats. It made the engagement ring Julian had once given her look like a toy from a cereal box. "You're pregnant!" Julian blurted out. It was an accusation, not a question. "We tried for 10 years. The doctors said you were barren. They said you couldn't carry a child." The silence that followed was deafening. Nearby tables went quiet. Alexander's eyes narrowed into slits. He slowly placed his napkin on the table and began to rise. The movement was like a panther uncoiling. He towered over Julian, standing a full 4 inches taller. "Watch your tone, Vance," Alexander said softly, a warning rumble. Sarah reached out and touched Alexander's arm, stopping him. "It's okay, Alex. Let him speak. It seems my ex-husband is confused about biology." She turned her gaze back to Julian, her eyes hard. "The doctors said we were having trouble, Julian. They said it was likely stress-induced or an incompatibility issue. They never said I was barren. You just stopped listening because you were too busy working late with your assistants." Julian felt like he had been slapped. "So," Julian whispered, glancing at the bump. "It's his—" "He has a name," Alexander cut in, stepping closer. "And yes, she is carrying my son. And unlike you, I intend to be there to see him grow up." "Julian." The shrill voice pierced the tension. Tiffany came clicking up on her heels, clutching her ruined dress. She looked at the scene, the powerful Alexander Sterling, the glowing Sarah, and the pale Julian, and her eyes went wide. "Oh my God," Tiffany said, looking at Sarah. "You're the ex-wife, the boring one?" Sarah smiled. It was a terrifying smile. "And you must be the reason I'm finally happy. I never got to thank you." Tiffany blinked, confused. "Thank me." "For taking out the trash," Sarah said sweetly. Julian's face turned purple. "Now wait a minute, Sarah. You can't speak to me like that. I built Vance Global. I gave you everything. You gave me anxiety and loneliness," Sarah corrected. "Alexander gave me a life." Mr. Vance, Alexander said, his voice dropping to a register that suggested violence was imminent. I think you and your companion should return to your table. You're disturbing my wife. Wife? Julian choked out. You're married? Last month, Alexander said, holding up his left hand to show a simple platinum band. Private ceremony in Lake Como. We didn't want the press, or the pests. He looked pointedly at Julian. Julian felt the ground crumbling beneath him. Sarah. His Sarah was Mrs. Alexander Sterling. She was now the co-owner of an empire 10 times the size of his own. This isn't over, Julian hissed, his ego trying to salvage something. You think you can just upgrade and forget where you came from, Sarah. I made you. Alexander took a step forward, but Sarah stood up. She moved slowly, gracefully. She looked Julian dead in the eye. You didn't make me, Julian. You broke me. But I rebuilt myself into something you can't even afford to look at. She turned to Alexander. Darling, I've lost my appetite. The air here has suddenly become very stale. Agreed, Alexander said. He signaled the maitre d' with a single raised finger. Wait, Julian said, desperation creeping in. He realized suddenly that his company, Vance Global, had a pending shipping contract with Sterling Maritime. A contract his company desperately needed to survive the next quarter. Sterling, wait. We have the contract renewal next week. We should keep business and personal matters separate. Alexander paused. He looked at Julian with genuine amusement. The contract. Alexander laughed. It was a dark, dry sound. Oh, Julian, you didn't check your email before dinner, did you? What? Julian asked, panic setting in. I cancelled the Vance Global contract an hour ago, Alexander said casually, as if discussing the weather. I don't do business with men who abandon their families. It's a character flaw. Bad for the bottom line. Julian froze. You can't. That contract represents 40% of my revenue. If you pull out, the stock crashes tomorrow morning. Then I suggest you sell your shares tonight, Alexander said. He placed a protective hand on Sarah's back. Come, my love, let's get pizza. I know a place that doesn't allow trash. As they walked away, leaving Julian standing in the middle of the restaurant with a stain on his ego and a screaming mistress by his side, Julian realized the nightmare had only just begun. The morning sun didn't rise over Vance Global headquarters. It crashed into it. Julian sat in his corner office on the 40th floor, staring at the Bloomberg terminal on his desk. His eyes were bloodshot, the result of a sleepless night spent pacing his penthouse floor, while Tiffany loudly packed her bags in the next room. She hadn't left him yet. She wasn't stupid enough to leave before securing a severance package, but the noise had been enough to drive him mad. But Tiffany was the least of his problems now. It's down 42%, Julian, Marcus, his CFO, shouted, not even bothering to knock as he stormed into the office. Marcus was usually a man of composure, but today his tie was crooked and he was sweating through his shirt. 42% in 30 minutes of trading. It's just a panic sell, Julian said, though his voice lacked conviction. He gripped his Mont Blanc pen so hard his knuckles turned white. Once I issue the press release clarifying the Sterling situation, there is no clarifying this. Marcus slammed a tablet onto Julian's mahogany desk. Have you looked online? Have you seen what's trending? Julian looked down. On the screen was a shaky video taken from a cell phone at l'Orangerie. It showed everything. The spilled scotch, Tiffany's screeching, Julian's pathetic attempt to intimidate Alexander Sterling, and finally, Alexander's devastating line, "I don't do business with men who abandon their families." The video had 12 million views. The hashtag #TeamSarah was the #1 trend globally. #Vance Global Meltdown was #2. "The investors aren't pulling out because of the contract, Julian," Marcus hissed. "They're pulling out because you look weak. You look like a fool who got cuckolded by the biggest shark in the ocean. The board is calling an emergency meeting at noon. They want your head." Julian stood up, slamming his hand on the desk. "I built this company. They can't touch me." "They can when you violate the morality clause in your contract," Marcus retorted. "And publicly harassing a pregnant woman who happens to be the wife of Alexander Sterling is definitely a violation." The intercom buzzed. It was his terrified secretary, Jessica. "Mr. Vance, there's a process server here. And Sterling's legal team." "Send them away," Julian roared. "We can't, sir. They're with the SEC." Julian fell back into his chair. The SEC. Sterling wasn't just pulling the contract, he was dissecting the carcass. An hour later, Julian was escorted out of his own conference room by 3 lawyers from the firm, Holloway and Pinch, the most aggressive legal sharks in New York. They handed him a cease and desist order regarding any communication with Sarah Sterling and a notice of a hostile takeover bid. Alexander Sterling wasn't just destroying him, he was buying him out for pennies on the dollar. Desperate, Julian called the one person he thought he could manipulate. He dialed Sarah's old number. It went straight to a disconnect message. He threw the phone against the wall, shattering the screen. "You think you've won?" he muttered to the empty room, his eyes manic. "I know your secret, Sarah. I know you." A dark, twisted idea began to form in Julian's mind. A delusion born of narcissism and desperation. Sarah couldn't be pregnant. Not naturally. They had tried for a decade. Thousands of dollars on specialists. Countless nights of timing cycles. If she was pregnant now, it meant one of 2 things. Either she had used a donor and didn't tell Alexander, or she had been cheating on him back then. Maybe the baby wasn't Alexander's. Maybe it was an IVF baby she had secretly arranged using his frozen samples from years ago. He had stored samples at the fertility clinic before the divorce, just in case. "That's it," Julian whispered, a sick smile spreading across his face. "She stole my genetic material. She stole my heir." It was insane. It was improbable. But to a man losing everything, it looked like a lifeline. If he could prove the baby was his, or at least drag her name through the mud with a lawsuit, he could force Alexander to back off. He could use the baby as leverage to save his company. He grabbed his landline. "Get me Saul Goodman, or whoever the hell is the best family lawyer in the city who isn't afraid of Alexander Sterling. I'm going to sue for custody." The conference room at Vanguard Legal was cold, sterile, and smelled of lemon polish and fear. Julian sat on one side of the massive glass table, flanked by Saul Berkowitz, a lawyer known for his cheap suits and cheaper morals. On the other side sat Sarah and Alexander. Sarah looked serene, her hands resting on her bump, wearing a cream-colored maternity dress that made her look like a Madonna painting. Alexander sat next to her, looking like a loaded weapon. He hadn't blinked in 10 minutes. Behind them stood a team of 5 lawyers from Sterling Croft and Moore. Mr. Vance, the lead lawyer for the Sterlings, a sharp-eyed woman named Eleanor Vance, no relation, thankfully began. "This petition is frivolous. You are claiming paternal rights to a child conceived 2 years after your divorce. I am claiming..." Julian said, leaning forward, his voice trembling with false confidence, "that Sarah stole my frozen genetic samples from the cryogenesis clinic. We had an agreement. That material was mine. If that baby is mine, I want half of everything, and I want Sterling to back off my company." Sarah looked at him, sadness in her eyes. Not fear. Sadness. "Julian, stop. Please. Don't do this to yourself." "Don't patronize me," Julian snapped. "We tried for 10 years, Sarah. You were the broken one. You were the one with the hostile uterus. That's what Dr. Aris Thorne said. Now suddenly you're fertile with him. I don't buy it. It's my baby." Alexander let out a low, dark chuckle. It was a terrifying sound. "Dr. Aris Thorne," Alexander repeated. He slid a thick manila folder across the glass table. "You mean this Dr. Thorne, the one who lost his medical license last year for falsifying records for wealthy clients?" Julian froze. That's irrelevant." "Is it?" Alexander opened the folder. "When Sarah told me about your struggle to conceive, I had my team look into the records. I wanted to make sure the pregnancy was safe for her. But we found something else." He pulled out a sheet of paper. It was an old lab report dated 5 years ago. "Read it, Julian," Alexander commanded. Julian looked at the paper. It was a semen analysis. His name was at the top. Subject Julian Vance. Diagnosis azoospermia 0 sperm count. Cause long-term abuse of illicit testosterone supplements and anabolic steroids. The room spun. "No," Julian whispered. "That's fake. My swimmers were fine. The doctor said they were fine." "The doctor was paid to tell you they were fine," Alexander said ruthlessly, "because you paid him an extra 20 grand a month for vitamin injections to keep you looking young and fit for the magazines. Those weren't vitamins, Julian. They were high-grade steroids. You sterilized yourself to look good in a suit." Sarah spoke up, her voice trembling slightly. "I went through 6 rounds of IVF, Julian. 6. Do you know how much that hurt? The needles, the hormones, the heartbreak every month when it didn't work. I blamed myself. I thought I wasn't enough of a woman." She stood up, tears welling in her eyes, not of sadness but of fury. "And all that time you knew, or you should have known. You let me take the fall for your vanity." "I didn't know," Julian stammered, looking at the report. The dates matched. The youth serum he had bought from Dr. Thorne. He had been warned about side effects, but he never read the fine print. He just wanted the energy. He wanted the muscle definition. "You had a 0 count, Julian," Alexander said, closing the file. 0. You couldn't get a woman pregnant if you were the last man on earth. This baby. This is a miracle. A natural miracle that happened because Sarah finally found a man who is actually a man, not a walking ego. Julian felt like he was suffocating. The narrative he had built his entire life around, that he was the strong provider, the virile alpha, and Sarah was the weak link, shattered instantly. "So," Saul Berkowitz, Julian's lawyer, said awkwardly, closing his briefcase. I think we're done here. I'm going to go. Good luck, Julian. My bill is in the mail." Saul scurried out of the room, leaving Julian alone with the wolves. "You have humiliated my wife," Alexander said, standing up. "You have wasted my time, and you have tried to claim my son." He leaned across the table, his face inches from Julian's. "I was going to just buy your company and fire you. But now I'm going to erase you." "You can't," Julian whispered. "I already have," Alexander replied. "While you were sitting here playing lawyer, My team executed the margin call on your personal loans. You leveraged your penthouse and your yacht to keep the stock price up this morning, didn't you?" Julian's eyes went wide. He had. It was a desperate move to stop the bleeding. "The stock dropped another 30% while we were talking." Alexander checked his watch. "The bank has seized your assets. You're homeless, Julian. And since Vance Global just filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection to avoid my takeover, you're also unemployed." Sarah walked to the door, placing a hand on the doorknob. She looked back at Julian one last time. "I used to pray that you would change, Julian," she said softly. "Now I just thank God you didn't, because if you had been a better man, I might have stayed, and I would have missed out on everything that actually matters." She walked out. Alexander buttoned his jacket, gave Julian a look of pure disgust, and followed her. Julian sat alone in the cold conference room. The silence was absolute. He looked down at the medical report. Azoospermia. He hadn't just lost his wife. He hadn't just lost his company. He had lost his legacy. He was the end of his line. And then his phone buzzed. It was a text from Tiffany. "Saw the news about the bankruptcy. The locks on the penthouse just changed, and the doorman won't let me in to get my Louboutins. You are a joke. Don't ever call me." Julian put his head in his hands, and for the first time in 20 years, he wept. But nobody was there to hear it. The fall wasn't a straight line. It was a series of jagged, painful crashes. 3 weeks after the meeting at Vanguard Legal, Julian stood on the sidewalk outside the building that used to be his home. It was a crisp autumn day in New York, the kind of day he used to love because it meant breaking out his cashmere coats. Today he wore a windbreaker he had bought at a discount store, and he was freezing. Across the street, a crowd had gathered. They weren't there for him. They were there for his things. The auctioneers had set up a tent. Julian watched, hidden behind oversized sunglasses, as a gavel banged down. "Sold to the gentleman in the back, the 1965 Aston Martin DB5 for $1.2 million. That was his car. The car he had restored himself. The car he had planned to drive to the Hamptons next summer. Gone. "Next item," the auctioneer boomed, his voice amplified by a speaker system that grated on Julian's ears. "A collection of vintage watches. Patek Philippe, Rolex, Audemars, Piguet. Bidding starts at $50,000. Julian felt a phantom weight on his left wrist. He had sold his last Rolex, the Daytona, to a pawn shop in the Bronx 3 days ago just to pay the retainer for a criminal defense lawyer. He got a fraction of its worth because he was desperate, and the pawnbroker smelled blood. "Mr. Vance!" Julian jumped. He turned to see a young man standing next to him. It was Kevin, his former personal assistant. The kid looked uncomfortable, holding a cardboard box of personal items. "Kevin," Julian said, forcing a smile that felt like cracking plaster. "Good to see you. I assume you're here to help me get back on my feet. I have a few ideas for a startup, low overhead, high yield." Kevin took a step back. "Actually, Mr. Vance, I'm just here to give you this. Security cleared out your desk. It's mostly trash. Old photos. Your stress ball." Kevin handed him the box. It was light. And, Kevin hesitated, looking at his shoes. "I wanted to let you know. I got a new job." "Oh." Julian's eyes lit up. "Where?" "Maybe you can put in a word. I'm willing to consult. I have C-suite experience, Kevin. Any firm would be lucky to have me." Kevin grimaced. I'm working for Sterling Maritime now, in the philanthropy division. The name hit Julian like a physical blow. Sterling, of course. Mrs. Sterling Sarah. She hired a bunch of the support staff that got laid off when Vance Global went under. Kevin explained, his voice filled with admiration. She said it wasn't our fault leadership was incompetent. She gave us full benefits, Mr. Vance. Dental vision, everything. She's really great. Incompetent, Julian whispered. I have to go, Kevin said quickly, sensing the volatility in Julian's eyes. Good luck, Julian. Not Mr. Vance. Just Julian. Kevin walked away, disappearing into the subway station, heading toward a future that Julian was barred from. Julian wandered the streets for hours. He couldn't go back to the hotel. His credit card had been declined this morning. He had $40 in cash in his pocket. He ended up in a dive bar in Hell's Kitchen, a place with sticky floors and no windows. He ordered a cheap beer and stared at the television mounted in the corner. The news was on. CNBC. Breaking news, the anchor announced. Sterling Maritime announces record profits following the acquisition of Vance Global's shipping routes. Alexander Sterling, CEO, credits the success to a new strategic direction led by his wife and business partner, Sarah Sterling. The screen cut to a clip of Sarah. She was cutting a ribbon at a new community center in Brooklyn. She looked heavier now, heavily pregnant, glowing with health and happiness. Alexander stood beside her, looking at her as if she hung the moon. A reporter thrust a microphone in her face. Mrs. Sterling, any comment on the rumors regarding your ex-husband's legal troubles? Sarah paused. She didn't look angry. She didn't look vindictive. She looked peaceful. I wish him peace, Sarah said simply. Everyone deserves a chance to learn from their mistakes. I'm just focused on my family and our future. The bar patrons grumbled. Classy lady, the bartender muttered, wiping a glass. That ex-husband of hers sounds like a real piece of work, though. Heard he cooked the books for years. Julian shrank into his coat. Yeah, he whispered into his beer. A real piece of work. That night, Julian slept in a shelter in the Bowery. The bed was hard, the room smelled of bleach and unwashed bodies, and he had to tie his shoes to his ankles so they wouldn't get stolen. Lying in the dark, listening to the coughing of strangers, Julian realized the true depth of his poverty. It wasn't just the lack of money. It was the silence. His phone never rang. No one needed him. No one feared him. He was a ghost. 4 months later. February. The winter in New York was brutal, but it was colder inside the courtroom at 100 Center Street. Julian sat at the defense table. He had lost 20 pounds. His suit, once bespoke, now hung loosely on his frame. It was wrinkled. He didn't have a steamer anymore, and he was living in a studio apartment in New Jersey that had a leaky radiator. Mr. Vance, Judge Harrison boomed. The judge was a stern woman, with no patience for white-collar criminals. You are charged with 7 counts of securities fraud, 3 counts of embezzlement, and conspiracy to defraud investors. How do you plead? Not guilty, Julian said, though his voice shook. It was a lie, and everyone knew it. The audit Alexander Sterling's team had done on Vance Global had unearthed everything. To maintain his lavish lifestyle and Tiffany's shopping habits, Julian had been moving money from the employee pension fund into his personal offshore accounts. He had planned to pay it back, eventually, once the next big contract came in. But the contract never came. Alexander Sterling had seen to that. The trial was set for 2 months from now. But Julian knew he wouldn't survive a trial. The evidence was overwhelming. His public defender, a weary man named Mr. Gorski, had told him his only shot at leniency was a character witness, someone of high standing who could vouch for his good character prior to the crimes, but who Tiffany had sold her story to a tabloid and moved to LA with a rapper. His old business partners were testifying against him to save their own skins. He had one card left to play, the wildest, most desperate card. Sarah. If Sarah Sterling, the darling of the media and the wife of the victim. Technically, Sterling Maritime lost money in the acquisition. Initially stood up and asked for mercy. Maybe the judge would give him probation instead of 10 years in Rikers Island. He had to see her. He knew where she would be. The news had been blasting it all week. The Sterling Gala for Children's Health was tonight at the Plaza Hotel. It was Sarah's first public appearance since giving birth to her son. Julian spent his last $50 on a haircut and a shoe shine. He couldn't get into the gala. Tickets were $10,000 a plate, but he knew the layout of the plaza. He knew where the VIPs exited. He stood in the freezing alleyway behind the hotel for 3 hours. Snow began to fall, dusting his shoulders. He shivered, blowing into his hands. He felt like the little match girl, a story Sarah used to read to her nieces. The irony was bitter like bile. At 11:00 p.m., the back doors opened. Security guards stepped out first, creating a perimeter. Then came Alexander Sterling. He looked powerful, wearing a tuxedo that fit him like armor. He was carrying a car seat. Behind him came Sarah. She wore a silver gown and a heavy fur coat. She looked tired, but radiantly happy. "Wait here, I'll bring the car around," Alexander said, to her handing the car seat to a bodyguard so he could pull the limousine up himself. A rare gesture of normalcy for a billionaire. Sarah stood alone by the door for a moment, adjusting her coat. "Sarah," Julian rasped. He stepped out of the shadows. The security guards instantly tensed hands, moving to their holsters. "Hold on," Sarah said, raising a hand. She squinted into the dark. "Julian." He stepped into the light. He looked pathetic. His nose was red from the cold, his eyes watery. "Sarah," he said again, his voice cracking. I need to talk to you." "You're violating the restraining order," one of the guards growled. "It's okay," Sarah said softly. "Let him speak." Julian fell to his knees. The cold pavement soaked through his thin trousers immediately. "Sarah, please," he begged. "I'm facing 10 years. 10 years in prison. I won't survive it. You know I'm not built for that. I'm scared." Sarah looked down at him. Her expression was unreadable. "I need a character witness," Julian sobbed. Just tell the judge that I wasn't always like this. Tell them about the early days, when we were happy. Please, do it for the memory of what we had." Sarah sighed. A puff of white breath escaped her lips. She walked closer to him, her heels clicking on the concrete. "The memory of what we had?" she asked quietly. "Julian, do you remember my 35th birthday?" Julian blinked, confused. I took you to dinner." "No," Sarah said. "You were in Dubai with a consultant. You sent me a text. You forgot. I spent the night crying in the bathroom because I felt so invisible." "I'm sorry." Julian wept. "I was a fool, but I'm paying for it now. Look at me. I have nothing." "You have exactly what you invested in," Sarah said. Her voice wasn't cruel. It was factual. You invested in vanity, you invested in greed, and you invested in people who didn't love you. This is the return on that investment." "Please," Julian whispered. "Just a letter to the judge. Mercy." At that moment, the bodyguard holding the car seat shifted. The blanket covering the baby slipped slightly. Julian looked up. He saw the sleeping face of the infant, a baby boy with a tuft of dark hair. "That's him?" Julian asked. "Yes," Sarah said, a smile touching her lips as she looked at her son. "That's Leo." "Leo?" Julian repeated. "He looks strong." "He is," Sarah said. She looked back at Julian. "I won't write the letter, Julian." Julian's head dropped. "Why, you said you wished me peace." "I do," Sarah said, "and prison might be the only place where you find it. Because out here, you'll just keep trying to climb a ladder that doesn't exist anymore. You need to stop running. You need to face who you are." Alexander's car pulled up. The sleek black Rolls-Royce purred to a halt. Alexander stepped out. He saw Julian on his knees. He didn't look surprised. He didn't look angry. He looked at Julian with profound pity. "Get in the car, Sarah," Alexander said gently. Sarah nodded. She stepped toward the car, then paused. She reached into her clutch bag. She pulled out a small card. "Here," she said, dropping it onto the wet ground in front of Julian. Julian picked it up with trembling fingers. It wasn't money. It wasn't a check. It was a business card for a legal aid pro bono counselor. A man named David Wright. "He's the best public defender in the state," Sarah said. "I pay his salary to help people who have hit rock bottom. Call him. He won't get you off, but he'll make sure you get a fair sentence. That's more than you gave me." She got into the car. Alexander took the baby from the guard, secured him inside, and walked around to the driver's side. Before he got in, he looked at Julian one last time. "She's right, you know," Alexander said. "The fall kills you, Julian. But the landing, that's where you decide if you're going to live or die." The Rolls-Royce drove away, tail lights fading into the snowy night. Julian was left kneeling in the slush, holding the card. He looked at the name. David Wright. He realized then that Sarah hadn't saved him from prison. She had saved him from his own delusion that he could talk his way out of it. He stood up, his knees shaking. He walked to a payphone on the corner. He didn't have a cell phone anymore. He inserted his last few quarters. He dialed the number on the card. "Hello?" A tired voice answered. "This is David Wright." "Mr. Wright," Julian said, tears freezing on his cheeks. "My name is Julian Vance. I think I'm ready to plead guilty." 3 years later. The seasons didn't matter much inside the Otisville Federal Correctional Institution. Time wasn't measured in fiscal quarters or holiday weekends anymore. It was measured in head counts, meal shifts, and the flickering buzz of the fluorescent lights in the library. Julian Vance, formerly the titan of New York logistics, was now inmate 8940. He pushed the heavy steel cart of returned books down the aisle of the prison library. The wheels squeaked a high-pitched rhythm that echoed in the silence. At 45, Julian looked a decade older. The stress of the trial and the hollow ache of prison life had stripped away the veneer of the boy wonder CEO. His hair, once dyed a rich chestnut to hide the grey, was now entirely silver. He had lost the soft paunch of expensive dinners and gained the wiry, hard calmness of a man who owned nothing. "Hey, Vance." The voice grated on his ears. It was Miller, a former hedge fund manager, serving 12 years for a Ponzi scheme. Miller was the ghost of Julian's past self, still obsessed with the market, still hustling cigarettes for favors, still convinced he was just temporarily embarrassed rather than a criminal. "What is it, Miller?" Julian asked, not looking up, as he shelved a tattered copy of a John Grisham novel. "You see the drop today?" Miller whispered, leaning against the metal stack holding a smuggled newspaper from 3 days ago. "Tech sector is bleeding. If I had a phone, just one phone, I could short the whole market and buy this prison by Tuesday." "You don't have a phone, Miller," Julian said softly. "And you don't have a portfolio. You have a mop bucket and a bunk bed." Miller sneered, his bravado cracking. "Don't act like you're a monk, Vance. You miss it. I know you do. The jets, the suits, the women." "I don't miss the noise," Julian lied. Or maybe it wasn't a lie anymore. He wasn't sure. "Well, speaking of the life," Miller said, a cruel glint in his eye. He pulled a glossy magazine out from under his uniform shirt. It was the latest issue of Fortune. "Look who's on the cover. I think you used to share a zip code with her." He tossed the magazine onto Julian's cart. Julian froze. He stared at the glossy cover, his breath catching in his throat like a shard of glass. It was Sarah, but it wasn't the Sarah. He remembered the quiet woman who wore cardigans and apologized for taking up space. This woman was a force of nature. She was photographed, standing on the prow of a massive container ship, the wind whipping her hair back, wearing a white tailored suit that radiated power. Her chin was lifted, her eyes sharp and intelligent. The headline was in bold gold letters: "The Renaissance of Shipping, How Sarah Sterling Saved the Supply Chain." "Go on," Miller goaded him. "Read it. Torture yourself a little." Julian's hand trembled as he picked up the magazine. He didn't want to look, but he couldn't look away. He opened it to the center spread. The article detailed the meteoric rise of Sterling Maritime under Sarah's co-leadership. It described how she had implemented green technology that Julian had once laughed at in board meetings, calling it hippie nonsense. That nonsense had saved the company billions and revolutionized the industry. But it was the personal section that felt like a knife twisting in his gut. "I owe my success to my partner in life and business." Alexander Sarah was quoted. "He gave me the one thing my previous life lacked belief. He didn't just open doors for me. He built the building." Julian closed his eyes. Belief. He had given her criticism. He had given her doubt. He turned the page. There was a photo of the family at their estate in the Hamptons, the same estate Julian had once tried to buy but couldn't afford. Alexander Sterling stood tall and protective, his hand resting on the shoulder of a young boy. The caption read, "Alexander Sterling with son Leo, 3, and daughter Grace, 1. Leo. The boy Julian had tried to sue for. The boy he had claimed was his property. The child looked nothing like Julian. He had Alexander's dark, intense eyes and Sarah's gentle smile. He looked happy. He looked safe enough. "That's the kid, huh?" Miller asked, looking over Julian's shoulder. "The heir to the throne. Must sting, Vance. Knowing some other guy is raising your legacy." Julian looked at the picture of the little boy. He remembered the medical report. Azoospermia. "He's not my legacy, Miller." Julian whispered the truth, finally settling in his chest without bitterness. "I never had a legacy. I was a dead end. Alexander. He's the father that boy deserves." Miller scoffed, kicking the bottom of the bookshelf. "You've gone soft, man. If that were me, I'd be plotting. I'd be writing a tell-all book. The real Sarah Sterling. You could make millions from inside here." Julian looked at Miller with profound pity. And do what with it? Buy better ramen at the commissary. You still don't get it. Get what? She didn't win because she took my money, Julian said, his voice gaining strength. She won because she escaped me. I was the anchor. I was the toxicity. The moment she cut me loose, she soared. That's the hard karma, Miller. It's not that I'm in here. It's that she is better off without me. Proven. Mathematically. Spiritually. Better. Miller shook his head, disgusted by the lack of malice. He turned to walk away, but then stopped. You got mail, by the way. Guard dropped it at the desk while you were in the back. Probably a bill. Julian's heart skipped a beat. He abandoned the cart and walked quickly to the front desk. There, sitting on the scratched linoleum counter, was a cream-colored envelope. The paper was thick, expensive. The handwriting was elegant. He picked it up. His hands shook so hard he almost dropped it. He carefully tore open the seal. There was no check, no legal summons, no gloating news clipping. Inside was a simple card and a folded piece of construction paper. He opened the card first. Julian, I saw on the news that your appeal was denied. I wanted to write not to gloat, but to close a door properly. For a long time I hated you. I hated how small you made me feel. But hate is a heavy thing to carry, and I have too much joy in my life now to hold on to old baggage. I forgive you, not because you deserve it, but because I deserve peace. And I hope in the quiet of that place you finally meet the man you were supposed to be before the money got in the way. Take care of yourself. Sarah. Julian felt a hot tear slide down his cheek, tracing a path through the coarse hair of his beard. He swallowed hard, trying to keep his composure in the middle of the prison library. He unfolded the construction paper. It was a drawing done in erratic, enthusiastic crayon strokes. It showed a tall stick figure with a blue suit, a smaller stick figure with long hair, and a tiny stick figure holding a yellow ball. A bright, jagged sun took up the entire corner of the page. On the back, in Sarah's handwriting, it said, Leo drew this. He asked who the sad man was that Mommy used to know. I told him you were someone who got lost. He said he drew you a sun so you could find your way back. Julian stared at the yellow sun. A 3-year-old boy, the son of his greatest rival, the child he had tried to weaponize in court, had sent him a light in the dark. A sob broke from his chest, a ragged, ugly sound that echoed off the metal shelves. Miller turned around from the doorway. What is it? Bad news, lawyer, quit. Julian looked up, tears streaming freely now, unashamed. He held up the drawing. No. Julian choked out, a strange, broken smile forming on his face. It's the best thing I own. It's a scribble, Miller muttered, confused. It's mercy, Julian said. It's pure, undeserved mercy. The buzzer for the evening lockdown blared a harsh mechanical scream that signaled the end of the day. Julian carefully folded the drawing and placed it inside his shirt pocket, right over his heart. He left the magazine on the cart. He didn't need to look at it anymore. He didn't need to envy Alexander Sterling or mourn the loss of the company. He walked toward the line of inmates forming by the door. For the first time in years, the crushing weight on his chest felt lighter. He was poor. He was imprisoned. He was alone. But as he touched the paper in his pocket, Julian Vance realized he was finally painfully starting to become a real human being. And that was a start. The metal gate slammed shut with a final echoing clang, sealing him in. But in the darkness of his cell that night, Julian didn't dream of stock tickers or penthouses. He dreamed of a yellow sun and the possibility of redemption. And that is the story of Julian Vance, a man who had everything and lost it all because he couldn't see the value of what was right in front of him. It's a brutal reminder that the grass isn't greener on the other side, it's greener where you water it. Julian watered his ego, while Alexander Sterling watered Sarah's potential. In the end, karma didn't just punish Julian. It taught him the hardest lesson of all, that true wealth isn't in your bank account, but in the loyalty and love of the people you cherish. What do you think? Did Julian deserve a harsher punishment, or was the realization of his loss enough? And would you have forgiven him if you were? Sarah. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of drama, karma, and redemption, please hit that like button. Share this video with a friend who needs a reality check, and don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a new story.